Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, the most merciful and the most beneficent. First of all, I welcome to all of you in the course of History of English Literature. I hope that you people will learn and enjoy a lot in this course. The topic which we are going to discuss that is related to Victorian age, and it is characteristics of Victorian age. I am going to recommend you some books which can be helpful for you people in this course. You can use History of English Literature by B.R. Mullick, that is written in very easy and simple language. You can also go through the book of History of English Literature by Miles Legby, by T. Singh, and by Arthur Compton Rickett. Similarly, there are other books that are available in the market, and you can easily go through them and increase your knowledge and further gain benefit from your studies. Dear students, as I have already mentioned, that we are going to talk about characteristics of Victorian age. Basically, Victorian age comes after Romantic age and it comes before modern age. Victorian age is the age of rapid social and political changes, and it's important that as students we must have knowledge of these socio-historical conditions that took place during Victorian age, because these socio-historical conditions can provide us a better background and help us to understand the literary works that were written during this period. Victorian age is called Victorian age because it is named after the reign of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria's accession occurred in 1837 and it lasted till 1901. Queen Victoria became the Queen of England. That is why this is known as Victorian age. It's known as Victorian age after Queen Victoria, as Elizabethan age is named after Queen Elizabeth. Though the dates of 1830 and 1832 are also sometime mentioned with reference to Victorian period. Let me explain these two dates, that how these two dates are associated with Victorian period. Basically, 1830 marks the end of Romanticism. The great writers, the great Romantic writers like William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Sir Walter Scott, though they were alive during these years, but they were unable to produce great literary works as they had produced earlier. Similarly, the younger Romantic poets like John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Gordon Byron, they had died. Because of these events, 1830 marks the end of Romanticism and the start of Victorian age. 1832 is sometime mentioned with reference to Victorian period because many political changes took place during this year. Particularly the first Reform Act of 1832 and the second Reform Act of 1867, and then the repeal of the Corn Law 1846. These acts were passed from the Parliament. As far as the first Reform Act of 1832 and the second Reform Act of 1867 is concerned, these two acts gave the power of vote, gave the right of vote to the middle class people, and in this way the middle class people had basically an opportunity to have their representatives in the House of Commons. As far as the repeal of the Corn Law 1846 is concerned, this act gave many advantages to the manufacturing people. Now, there is point to explore for you people. You can browse the net and you can go through the books to further know the details of 1830 and 1832, and how these two dates are sometime mentioned with reference to Victorian period. In derogatory sense, the term Victorian refers to certain characteristics. These characteristics are complacency, hypocrisy, sexual priggishness, preservation of feminine innocence, and an emphasis on social respectability. I am going to touch upon these characteristics one by one. Complacency means to be satisfied with the things the way they are without complaining against them. In Victorian period, England was becoming a colonial empire, and because of that it was expanding its territory. Similarly, England, which was formerly an agricultural country, was becoming an industrial country due to the advancement of science. On the other hand, because of this process of industrialization, there was poverty, injustice, starvation, and many slummy areas were visible in England. The writers of the period, some writers of the period, have accepted all this situation without any complaint, and they have compromised with this situation. That is why sometimes this age is referred as age of complacency and age of compromise. Hypocrisy. On the one hand, the people of England during Victorian period were giving great emphasis on the observance of moral values, but on the other hand, there was violation of these moral values. And the writers of the period, particularly the novelists like Charles Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray, and George Eliot, have reflected this duality, duplicity, and hypocrisy of their characters in their novels. Sexual priggishness means that you cannot openly discuss issues related to sex, and if you are going to discuss these issues, the people will get offended and they will get irritated. There was hush-hush sort of attitude during Victorian period with reference to sex. Preservation of feminine innocence. It means that virginity and chastity were considered great values with reference to women, and there was no tolerance of extramarital relationship, or there was no tolerance of any other sort of love affairs, in particularly in case of women. There was emphasis on social respectability. Social respectability means that a person must have a good social image, respect in the society, and if he does not have that respect or that good image in the society, it means that the person is socially non-entity. All of these characteristics can be easily explored in George Eliot's novel Mill on the Floss, because that is a representative work of the period. And all these characteristics can be found in the characters that either belong to the Dodson family or belong to the Tulliver family in George Eliot's novel Mill on the Floss. Victorian age is the age of great writers. Almost in all genres, we have great writers in Victorian age. In poetry, we have the example of Lord Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and many other poets. In prose, we have two great prose writers, Carlyle and then Ruskin. Basically, it was the genre of novel in which literature flourished during this age. And in the novel, we have examples of William Makepeace Thackeray, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy. Victorian age is, as I have already said, Victorian age is mainly known because of its novelists. And it is during this period in the genre of novel we see that modern psychological novel was introduced, particularly by the writers like George Eliot and George Meredith. In criticism, we have critics like Walter Pater, Newman, and so on. It is age of literary movements. The two movements which are very important during this age are the pre-Raphaelite movement and aesthetic movement. The pre-Raphaelite movement. Basically, the pre-Raphaelite movement was founded by 7 painters and poets who are also known as the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. These basically 7 poets and painters were William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Michael Rossetti, James Collinson, Frederick George Stephens, and Thomas Woolner. The pre-Raphaelites focused on pictorial elements, symbolism, sensuousness, attention to minute details, interest in medieval and supernatural in their paintings and in their poetry. Basically, it was due to emphasis on sensuousness. They are known as fleshy school of poetry as well. They are known as fleshy school of poetry because they gave great attention to the details of body and to the physical charms of the body. That is why they are known as the fleshy school of poetry. The second movement which was started during this period is known as the aesthetic movement, and the main advocates of this movement were Oscar Wilde and Swinburne. And this movement emphasized art for art's sake. Basically, in literature there are two schools. One is art for life's sake and other is art for art's sake. Art for life's sake says that the purpose of art is to give moral lessons, to teach values, to instruct to the people. As far as the other school, art for art's sake, is concerned, it focuses on that beauty should be the end of art, and the purpose of artist is to increase and to develop the aesthetic sense of its readers. Victorian age is a very lengthy age as compared to other ages in the history of English literature, because it covers many years. Right in the beginning I told you that this age starts with the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837 and it lasts till 1901. Victorian age is usually divided into two periods, early Victorian age and later Victorian age, and then early Victorian age is further bifurcated into poets of early Victorian period, novelists of early Victorian period, and then prose writers of early Victorian period. Similarly, later Victorian age is also further divided into poets of the later Victorian period, novelists of the later Victorian period, and prose writers of the later Victorian period. Basically, Victorian age is divided into early and late Victorian periods due to the fact that this age had many writers. And if we divide these writers into two groups, it will be easier for you people to understand things in a better perspective. Otherwise, there will be a possibility of confusion. So to avoid that confusion, I have divided the writers of the Victorian age into two groups. The writers of early Victorian age and then the writers of late Victorian age. They are further divided into poets of the early Victorian period, novelists of the early Victorian period, prose writers of the late Victorian period, and poets, novelists, and prose writers of the late Victorian period. Now I am going to talk about some salient features of the Victorian age. The first most important characteristic of Victorian age was the development of science, and particularly it was Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species that brought a great change in the socio-historical conditions of the period. Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species argues that as far as the ancestors of human beings are concerned, they are monkeys, and man has basically is a result of an evolutionary process. Besides this, it also argues that survival of the fittest and struggle for life are important characteristics. Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species shook the Christian belief in the immortality of human soul, and because of this, some people became agnostics and some followed the old faith. Agnostic means that they didn't believe in God, or they didn't believe in the hereafter and the immortality of the human soul. This scientific this development of science fostered skepticism, and people started looking everything from suspicious eyes, and because of this there was unrest, shaken faith, and pessimism during this period. Matthew Arnold and Tennyson, who are the representative poets of the period, they have expressed this pessimism, shaken faith, and unrest in their works. There was a sort of spiritual malaise, and Matthew Arnold, in one of his poems, rightly says, hanging between two worlds, one dead and other yet to be born. This development of science encouraged commercialism and materialism among the people of the period. With reference to the development of science, another thing which took place during this period was that this development of science nurtured a peculiar scientific temper among the writers of the period, and they adopted a scientific method having detailed description with accuracy. In this context, the names of Lord Alfred Tennyson, Carlyle, Dickens, Charles Kingsley, Charles Reid are very important, because in their works, whatsoever they have described, they have given a detailed description, and there is accuracy in their description. Basically, that was under the influence of development of science that the writers became accurate and detailed in their descriptions. The second important characteristic of Victorian age is the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution is also known as French Revolution. The main slogan of French Revolution was liberty, fraternity, and equality. Though French Revolution started in 1760, but its climax can be seen in Victorian age. French Revolution, as a result of French Revolution, the people were thinking that they will be getting freedom from the cruel clutches of landlords, feudal lords. But basically this was a mistaken idea. It was only a change of masters. Formerly, the masters of the peasants, the serfs, the farmers were landlords. Now their masters were industrialists and mill owners. So it was only a change of masters, and the way people were thinking that there will be a golden period in the history of mankind, and they will be having fraternity, liberty and equality. Nothing like that happened. Even in Romantic period, William Wordsworth and some other writers have also expressed their dissatisfaction and disappointment with the French Revolution. As I have already said, that basically French Revolution was an industrial revolution. Because of this industrial revolution, England, that was known as a agricultural country, was rapidly becoming an industrial country. Because of this industrial revolution, two classes were born in England. On the one hand, there were mill owners and industrialists, and on the other hand, there were poor and laborers, poor people and laborers. Because of this industrial revolution, the gap between the rich and the poor increased significantly, and drive for material and commercial success was seen to propagate a kind of moral decay in the society itself. Basically, industrial revolution promoted commercialism and materialism, and because of this materialism and commercialism, there was a kind of spiritual death or spiritual malaise in the Victorian society. No doubt, industrial revolution produced great wealth for the middle class people, but it also caused the transformation of merry rural England into a sooty and squalid England. When we talk of romanticism basically means that there is return to nature, and the poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Gordon Byron and Keats, they have painted beautiful natural scenes in their poetry. And you see that Wordsworth is known as the worshipper of nature, Keats is known as the worshipper of beauty, particularly the beauty with reference to Greek art and even with reference to nature. In Romanticism, there was the celebration of rich countryside, landscape, and beauty of flora and fauna. Right? You see that Romantic poets are talking about the chirping of birds, right? The song of cuckoo, the song of nightingale. They are describing the beauty of flowers like daffodils, like roses, and they are describing the beauty of the landscape, like the beauty of canals and the rivers and so on and so forth. But what we see in Victorian age is that as a result of industrial revolution, there was a network of railway tracks in England, and there was establishment of steel industry. Because of these two things, the destruction of natural beauty, like the beauty of the woods and the rural areas, took place. The trees were chopped and cut in the woods for railway tracks and industries. Ruskin, who is the representative writer of the period, has expressed his disappointment and his dissatisfaction with the industrial revolution, and he has condemned the development of science in his work. Industrial revolution caused many other social problems, and among them the problems like urbanization, massive poverty, child labor and slummy areas are important. Because of this industrial revolution, the people who were formerly living in countryside, in villages, they moved from villages to the cities, and because of that large scale migration, there were many social issues like cleanliness and poverty, and even the middle class people were forced to send their children to industries to earn their livelihood, to meet their expenditures. So child labor was also there. Now I am leaving a point to explore for you people, is that The Cry of the Children by Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. These two works are important, in which you can explore these social problems. You can read these social problems in detail. The third characteristic of Victorian age is the progress of democracy. During this period, democracy progressed very much, and that progress is evident in the form of many reform bills that were passed from the parliament of the period. And in those bills, particularly the Reform Act of 1837 and the Reform Act of 1867, and then repeal of Corn Law 1846 are very important. These reforms bills basically gave right to the more and more middle class people, gave right of voting to more and more middle class people, and subsequently the middle class people had their representatives in the parliament of the time. Because of this rise of middle class, the interest of the writers can be seen in the lives of the poor people, common people. And when you start reading particularly the novels of the period, like the novels of Thackeray, Dickens, George Meredith, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy, you can see that they have taken their heroes from common people, mean middle class people. It was basically due to the progress of democracy, because the common people became the focal point at that time. The fourth characteristic of the period is stress on morality. At that time, the Victorian people gave great importance to the observance of moral values. Strict societal codes were enforced, and certain activities were openly looked down upon. It was suggested that how you have to talk with people, what sort of dress you have to wear, and whether it is appropriate or inappropriate. And as far as women were concerned, women were expected that they should be angels, they should be docile, submissive, they should be very pious and virtuous. And as I have already mentioned, that the concept of virginity and chastity was very important in the minds of the Victorian people. And the women of the period had no professional freedom and no financial freedom. If you explore if you read some novels of the period, particularly the novels written by female writers, you see that in the heroines or in the female characters of the period, the female characters have no professional freedom and no financial freedom. And in this respect, again, George Eliot's novel The Mill on the Floss is a representative work of the period, in which you can see that how there is emphasis on the observance of the moral values, and how Maggie Tulliver has no financial freedom and no professional and has no financial freedom. The fifth characteristic of Victorian age is prudishness in matters of sex. During Victorian period, nobody was allowed to talk about sex openly and publicly, because it was considered a sort of taboo. And if anybody was going to talk about sex, the people got offended and irritated. So there was a sort of hush-hush attitude towards sex. That is why the writers of the period have not talked about sexual issues and sexual themes or the sexual relations of their characters in their works. There was no concept of impropriety in dress. In modern times, you can see that women in England can wear topless dresses and mini skirts, but in Victorian period, these things were considered improper and were not allowed to wear such sort of dresses. Sixth characteristic of Victorian age is the mixture of opposing elements, like number one, that it was age of faith and age of doubt at the same time. It was age of pessimism and optimism. And let me mention the names of Matthew Arnold, Lord Alfred Tennyson, who were the representative poets of the period, and they have reflected pessimism in their poetry. On the other hand, Browning, who is also a Victorian poet, but he has expressed optimism in his poetry, particularly in one of his poems. He says that God is in his heaven and all is well with the world. It was age of morality and hypocrisy, and it was age of prosperity and poverty, and it was age of romanticism and classicism. It was age of idealism and materialism at the same time. Because of this mixture of opposing elements, it's not easier to describe Victorian age in one sentence or in a simple way. Rather, because of this mixture of opposing elements, Victorian age is complex and multidimensional. Seventh characteristic of Victorian age is that it was an age of realism. Simple definition of realism is that the faithful representation of reality, or representation of reality without exaggerating and idealizing it. The writers of the period, particularly the novelists like Dickens, Thackeray, George Eliot, George Meredith, and Thomas Hardy, they are realists. They are realists in the sense that they have reflected the socio-historical conditions of the period, the socio-historical problems of the period in their works. And at the same time, they are idealists as well, because they cherish some ideals like truth, justice, freedom, and so on. On one side, their works are rooted in the socio-historical conditions of the period, but at the same time, they are critics of the age as well. They have criticized the social problems of the period in their works as well. Eighth characteristic of Victorian age is that there is didactic element in the literary works of the period, because writers of the period thought that it was their duty to teach and instruct moral values to the audience of the period. That is why through their literary works they have tried to give moral lessons and teach moral values to the people of the period. The Victorian age comprises a period of more than 60 years. It's a long period of material prosperity, political upheavals, and scientific progress. The material prosperity was largely due to the Industrial Revolution and scientific progress, which came as a blessing and to some as a curse. It was an age alive with activities in all spheres. England, a small island, became the hub of commercial enterprises. She had markets all over the world. Science was laid under contribution, and mills and factories were set up in Birmingham and Manchester. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was the dazzling symbol of the commercial supremacy of the nation, and it inaugurated a new age of material prosperity and scientific progress. It was one side of the picture, the other being dark and dismal. As cities and towers were proliferating, squalid slums were also steadily growing in all parts of England. Dickens and Mrs. Gaskell, Ruskin and Matthew Arnold, Carlyle and Charles Kingsley were never tired of recording their protests against the so-called prosperity brought at an enormous price. the price of blood, sweat, and tears of ill-fed men and children, whose condition was indescribably appalling. With the advancement of civilization, there was cultural decline during Victorian age. And this has been beautifully expressed by Matthew Arnold in his work Culture and Anarchy. In this work, Arnold talks about that how Victorian age, that how there was disorder and lack of discipline in Victorian age. And he also suggested a solution. His solution was that it's art that can help human beings to become civilized and cultured. He said that arts is the last stay and sport of civilization. It is through arts and literature people can become noble, civilized, and cultured. As civilization was advancing, culture was declining in the Victorian age. At least that was the complaint of a section of the intellectuals. Matthew Arnold said that I am a liberal, yet, yes, I am a liberal, tempered by experience, reflection, and renouncement, and I am above all a believer in culture. John Stuart Mill, in his work on liberty, also thought seriously of the problems of liberty, democracy, and culture. And he argued in his work the peculiar civil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race. J.S. Mill was the warmest advocate of democracy and freedom. As he said again, the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others or impede their efforts to obtain it. During Victorian period, we see that though there was continuity of romantic temperament, but even the romantic temperament seems to decline. Tennyson and Browning, who expressed some romantic temperament in their poetry, yet they were unable to sustain the romantics' confidence in the autonomy of their own imagination. There is no longer the same ability to create a vision of order and unity. Instead, there is a clear impression of the world as fragmented, of life being too complicated and painful for any real sense of order to be found. The feeling of confusion and despair that characterizes a lot of Victorian literature has much to do with the religious doubts and uncertainties of the period. Victorian literature might have been explicitly secular from the late 17th century onwards, but it is only in the Victorian period that a certain traditional religious confidence disappears. And with the disappearance of this confident faith in controlling deity, the world begins to seem much more confusing, depressing, and even chaotic. Victorian society was becoming increasingly complex, something that is reflected in the Victorian novel. The Victorian period was the great age of the novel, possibly because the novel was the only form that could expand enough to cope with the scale and complexity of the Victorian society, as it too expanded and changed with the growth of industrialization. The great novelists of the age are Charles Dickens and George Eliot, both of whom have tried to create a full and intricate picture of a complex Victorian social world. They are fully aware of the disorder, injustices, and hardships of the world they lived in, yet at the same time There is a confidence in their writing that the novel can confront the whole of life. I have suggested some books right in the beginning that you can go through. History of English Literature by B.R. Mullick, that is written in very easy and simple language. You can also go through the History of English Literature published by Oxford Books, written by Andrew Sanders, and you can also go through the History of English Literature by Emile Legge. There are some other books which I am recommending you people. You can go through them and you can increase your knowledge. These books include David Dash's Critical History of English Literature and Peck Coyle, Brief History of English Literature. Then Sanders, The Short History, Oxford History of English Literature, and Widdowson, The Palgrave Guide to English Literature and its Contexts.